When my father died, the house went to my half-brother, and I was left with nothing. I found out that my stepmother had been my father for 2 years, and then I never thought my father would pass so suddenly, though he'd been sick for what seemed like forever. Dad was only 61, but he'd become a shadow of himself in the last 2 years. What started as occasional complaints about fatigue and headaches turned into memory lapses and strange bouts of confusion. Every time I visited, it felt like he'd aged a decade since the last time I saw him. I kept asking him to go to different doctors, to try new treatments, but he'd brush me off. He'd say it was just age catching up and that he was too stubborn to keel over. I wish I'd pushed him harder. When he did pass, I was devastated but also ready, if that makes sense. I had a feeling his time was close, and I'd spent those last few visits with him trying to make peace with the idea. He was my dad. No matter what happened, no matter how distant we'd become since he remarried, I wanted to remember him well. So when we gathered for the will reading, I wasn't expecting anything crazy. My dad's house wasn't a mansion or anything, but it was the place we'd called home for so long, filled with memories of birthdays, holidays, and late-night talks. I was prepared to honor whatever he'd left me, feeling like it would help keep him alive in some way. I hadn't thought much about my stepmother Linda or her son Brandon. They'd been around, sure, but my relationship with them had always been complicated. Linda married my dad about 5 years ago, and while I didn't know her well, something about her always felt off. Maybe it was the way she looked at me, or the way she'd somehow monopolized Dad's attention whenever I was around. Brandon, on the other hand, was a total stranger to me. Technically, he was my half-brother, but there was no sibling bond there. He was 19, moody, and constantly looking like he had better things to do than hang around family. As I sat in the lawyer's office, surrounded by polished wood and leather chairs that felt way too fancy for my taste, I looked over at Linda and Brandon. They were sitting close together, whispering occasionally, and I couldn't shake the weird feeling creeping up my spine. Linda was barely holding back a smile, her eyes bright with some kind of satisfaction. Brandon, too, looked like he was suppressing a grin. Something was off, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. The lawyer, a reserved man named Mr. Hale, finally started reading the will. He went through the usual formalities, legal language that I tuned out, mentally preparing myself for what I assumed would be a split between me and Brandon, maybe a bit more in my favor since I was Dad's biological son. I was ready to share, even if I didn't like them much. I just wanted a part of my father to hold on to. Then the words that came out of Mr. Hale's mouth hit me like a freight train. To my beloved wife Linda, I leave my house, all assets and belongings within it, as well as the entirety of my savings and investment accounts. To my stepson, Brandon, I leave my personal effects, including my collection of memorabilia, should he wish to keep them. There was a silence so thick it felt like I couldn't breathe. I waited, heart pounding, for Mr. Hale to say my name. Maybe there was some mistake, but he just closed the folder, looked around and offered a polite, "That concludes the reading of the will." I couldn't believe it. I sat there, completely frozen, trying to understand what had just happened. My father had left me nothing. Not a single thing. Everything, the house, the assets, his belongings, went to Linda and Brandon, as if I didn't exist. My mind reeled, and I couldn't stop the torrent of questions. Asterisk how? Why? Asterisk. I felt a wave of nausea, then anger. Dad and I may not have been as close these past few years, but he wouldn't have just cut me out like that. No way. This had to be Linda's doing. I knew she'd gotten into his ear, controlling every aspect of his life toward the end, and now it was clear what she'd been planning all along. Linda looked over at me, and for a split second, I saw something in her expression, satisfaction. A small, almost smug smile crept up her face as she placed a hand on Brandon's shoulder, as if to reassure him. I couldn't sit there another second. I shot out of my seat, not caring if anyone thought I was being rude, and stormed out of the office. The fresh air hit me like a slap in the face, and I could finally breathe again. But the anger kept boiling over. I wanted answers, and I wanted them now. My Uncle Jake found me pacing outside. He'd been close with Dad and had attended the reading for moral support. Jake had always been a bit of a second father to me, especially when Dad remarried and got wrapped up in his new life. Seeing him felt like a lifeline. "What happened in there?" he asked, looking concerned. "Dad left everything to Linda and Brandon. Every single thing. I didn't get a dime, Jake. Nothing. How could he do that to me?" My voice cracked, and I hated how broken I sounded. Jake's face tightened, a mixture of anger and confusion. "That doesn't sound like your father. I know things changed when he remarried, but he always wanted to take care of you." "Exactly," I said, feeling a glimmer of validation. "This isn't him. This is Linda. She got to him, manipulated him somehow." "I know she did." Jake's expression turned thoughtful. "You know, he never looked well these past couple of years. Every time I saw him, he seemed weaker, more distracted. There were times he didn't even remember conversations we'd had just days before. I thought it was just age, but maybe—" I looked at him, heart pounding. "Maybe what?" Jake hesitated, like he didn't want to say what he was thinking. "Maybe it wasn't just age. Maybe Linda had a hand in that, too." It sounded insane, but the more I thought about it, the more it fit. I started remembering all those moments where Dad seemed out of it, barely able to focus or stay awake. Linda had been the one in charge of everything. His food, his medication. She'd always hovered around him, making sure he only ate what she prepared. And now, with the house and everything else in her name, she was set for life. "Jake," I said, feeling a dangerous resolve build inside me. "I'm not letting this go. I know something's wrong here, and I'm going to find out what it is." He nodded, a fierce determination in his eyes. "I'll help you, Adam. Your dad deserves the truth." As we walked away from the office together, I felt the weight of grief mixing with anger and determination. If Linda thought she could get away with taking everything from me, from my father, she was wrong. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And in that moment, as I looked back at the lawyer's office, I knew I was going to uncover whatever twisted game Linda had played. I was ready to go to any lengths necessary to get justice for my father and for myself. For the next few days, I couldn't get my father's sudden decline out of my mind. My memories of him over the past 2 years were muddled, a haze of frailty, forgetfulness, and confusion that never felt natural. I kept replaying every visit, every phone call, trying to piece together a timeline of when he started to change. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like Linda's influence had infected every part of his life. Linda. Even thinking her name filled me with disgust. The woman who had somehow weaseled her way into his heart, then siphoned off his life. It all felt so calculated now, but I needed more than suspicions if I wanted any chance at justice. I decided to reach out to people who had known Dad well, friends he'd been close to for years. They'd seen his decline too, and I needed to know what they thought. I started with George, an old college buddy of his who'd been like family to us. When I called, he didn't hesitate to meet up. We met at a local diner, a place Dad used to take me as a kid. George was quiet, thoughtful, and seemed to carry a heavy sadness in his eyes as he talked about my dad. "Adam," he said, leaning forward, "I noticed things changing with your father too. I remember this one day about a year ago. He showed up to lunch, but he seemed lost, confused. It was like he didn't know where he was, and he kept repeating himself. At the time, I thought maybe he was just tired, but looking back, he shook his head, his brow furrowed. It wasn't normal. He looked like he'd aged 20 years. Did he ever say anything to you about Linda?" I asked, hoping George might have picked up on something I hadn't. George looked uncomfortable. I didn't want to get into it, but, yeah, he mentioned once that she'd taken over everything. His meals, his pills, even his schedule. He joked that he couldn't sneeze without her permission. That gnawing feeling in my gut intensified. Linda had practically isolated him, controlled his every move, down to the food he ate and the medicine he took. She'd taken a healthy, energetic man and turned him into someone weak and compliant, a puppet. After talking to George, I met up with my dad's old doctor, Dr. Caldwell. When Dad had first started feeling off, Dr. Caldwell had been his physician, but apparently Linda had switched him to someone else after a few months. Dr. Caldwell didn't know the details but was willing to tell me what he remembered. He came in complaining of fatigue, headaches, and some nausea. Dr. Caldwell explained, looking through his old records. I couldn't find any specific cause, and I suggested some tests, but he never followed up. I always thought that was strange, considering how proactive he used to be about his health. He even missed a few scheduled appointments, which wasn't like him. Missed appointments? I asked, my heart sinking. Dr. Caldwell nodded. Yes, 2 or 3 in the span of a few months. The last time I saw him, he looked pale, thinner, and just not himself. I got the feeling that something was bothering him, but he didn't say much. Not long after that, his care was transferred to another doctor. I assumed it was just closer to home, but now I wonder. I could barely keep my composure as I thanked him and left the office. Each new detail felt like another layer of poison, adding up to a horrifying picture. Linda hadn't just manipulated him emotionally. She'd physically isolated him, weakened him, and made him dependent on her. I knew in my gut that something more sinister had been at play. My next stop was to visit a close friend of Dad's, Frank, who'd been his business partner for years. Frank was retired now, but he still kept in touch with our family. When I explained my suspicions, he went pale. You know, Adam, he said slowly, there was one time, maybe 8 months ago. Your father came to a meeting we had set up to discuss some personal investments. He was so out of it, he barely remembered his own name. It was terrifying. He kept repeating the same questions, and when I asked if he was okay, he just shrugged it off. Said Linda had been helping him with his medications, but he looked miserable. I had to drive him home that day because he was too disoriented to even find his car. Hearing that confirmed everything I feared. I thought back to how Dad had lost his independence, how Linda had micromanaged every aspect of his life until he barely recognized himself. If Linda was poisoning him, slowly chipping away at his health, it all made sense. His forgetfulness, his lethargy, his sudden reliance on her for everything. I decided to share what I'd found with Jake. We met up late that night at his house, and I laid everything out. The canceled doctor's appointments, the missing medications, the strange incidents. The more I talked, the angrier Jake became. That woman, Jake spat, was nothing but trouble from the beginning. I tried to warn your dad, but he didn't want to listen. Said she made him happy. I thought it was just loneliness, but now, he slammed his fist onto the table. Now I see what she was really after. We sat in silence for a while, both lost in thought. Finally, Jake looked at me, his face serious. Adam, if we're going to do this, we need proof. Real proof. Without it, there's no way we can bring her to justice. I nodded. I've been thinking the same thing. I just don't know where to start. She covered her tracks well, and the only ones who saw Dad in those last days were her and Brandon. Jake leaned back, rubbing his chin. Maybe we should start with Brandon. If he knew what she was doing, he might slip up. The thought made my stomach churn. Brandon had always been distant, almost hostile, and the idea of confronting him felt like walking into a lion's den. But he was part of this, and if there was any chance of finding out the truth, I had to do it. A few days later, I found an opportunity to talk to Brandon. I caught him outside the house, heading to his car, and called his name. He looked surprised, then annoyed, like he couldn't be bothered to deal with me. What do you want? He asked, crossing his arms. I decided to be blunt. I know about Dad. I know Linda was doing something to him, and I have a feeling you know about it too. His face froze, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. But then he laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. You're delusional. My mom loved him, more than you ever did. If he was sick, it was his own fault. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. Brandon, I'm not an idiot. I know something was going on, and I'm going to prove it. If you know anything, you'd be better off telling me now. He rolled his eyes, but I saw the way his hands trembled. You don't know anything. Just leave it alone, Adam. You're not going to find anything. With that, he got into his car and drove off, but I'd seen enough. His reaction had been all the confirmation I needed. Brandon knew something, maybe even had a role in whatever Linda had done. I couldn't help but wonder how far he was willing to go to protect his inheritance. I met up with Jake later that night and told him about the encounter. He listened intently, then sighed. He's scared, Adam. That means we're getting close. We just need to push a little harder. Get him to crack. Or Linda, I replied, a steely determination hardening within me. She's the one who orchestrated this whole thing. Brandon's just a puppet. I need to find a way to get her to slip up, to admit what she did. Jake nodded slowly. We'll find a way. But tread carefully. If she senses that you're onto her, who knows what she might do? As I left Jake's house that night, I felt a strange mixture of hope and dread. I was close, so close to exposing the truth. But I knew that digging any deeper meant putting myself in Linda's crosshairs. She'd already stolen my father's life. Now it was a matter of stopping her from ruining his legacy. And if it took every ounce of strength I had, I'd make sure she didn't get away with it. The confrontation was bound to happen sooner or later, and I couldn't wait any longer. My suspicions about Linda and Brandon had turned into a certainty that kept me awake at night. Every new piece of evidence, every strange story, pointed to one thing. My father hadn't just died of natural causes. He'd been poisoned, worn down piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the man he once was. And Linda had been at the center of it all. I needed to make her confess. Jake and I spent days going over every detail, every slip of the tongue from Brandon, every visit Dad had missed, and every strange story his friends had shared. We crafted a plan, not too intricate, but with one clear goal: to get Linda to let her guard down, to see if we could get her to admit to her actions. Jake suggested it might help to record the conversation discreetly, just in case she said something we could use later. I felt a pang of guilt even considering this approach, but I kept reminding myself, this was for Dad. The opportunity presented itself one afternoon when Linda was at the house alone. I hadn't been back there since Dad's death, but seeing it now, knowing it belonged to her and Brandon, made me sick. My childhood memories were still wrapped up in every room, every piece of furniture, yet here she was, acting as though she'd always belonged. She was in the kitchen when I walked in, stirring something on the stove, and she looked startled to see me. I hadn't given her any warning. I wanted to catch her off guard. Her eyes darted around the room, but she recovered quickly, slipping on her usual mask of forced kindness. Adam, she said with a fake smile, I didn't expect you. What brings you here? I didn't bother with pleasantries. We need to talk, Linda. About my father. She turned back to her pot, stirring slowly, as though she could simply brush me off. What's there to talk about, Adam? Your father's gone. We all need to move on. Her indifference nearly made me lose my temper. I know what you did, Linda, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. I know about the medications, the missed appointments, the way you isolated him, weakened him. I know you were slowly poisoning him. The spoon slipped from her fingers, clattering into the pot. She went very still, then slowly turned to face me, her face hardening. That's a very serious accusation, she said, her voice cool and completely unfounded. Oh, really? Then why is it that everyone who saw him in those last years noticed the same thing? That he was falling apart, that he didn't seem like himself? And why is it that you always seem to be right there, controlling everything he did? Linda narrowed her eyes, her calm demeanor slipping. You think you can come in here, accuse me of such vile things, and I'll just stand here and take it? You have no idea what you're talking about. I stepped closer, refusing to back down. Maybe I don't. Or maybe I know a lot more than you think. And maybe I'll go to the police and tell them everything I've found. Let's see what they make of it. There was a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or anger. She glanced around, as if calculating her options, then let out a bitter laugh. You really want to know the truth, Adam? Fine. Your father was a fool. He was weak. All that money, all that property, and he couldn't even take care of himself. I was the one who had to handle everything, who made sure things were in order. And yes, maybe I had to make a few adjustments. He was getting old, and someone needed to make sure the future was secure. Adjustments? I repeated, my stomach twisting. What kind of adjustments, Linda? She looked at me with a sneer. Nothing drastic. Just a little something to keep him calm, manageable. I did what needed to be done. I was horrified. She was practically admitting to drugging my father, controlling him until he was too weak to question her. I glanced at the corner where my phone was recording every word, feeling a sick thrill that her arrogance might be her downfall. And Brandon? I pushed, not willing to let her get away with brushing him aside. What does he know? Was he in on this too? Linda's expression faltered, and for a split second, I saw guilt flash across her face. Then she recovered, shrugging. Brandon knew what he needed to know. He understood the importance of keeping the family safe, of making sure that we were taken care of. And when the time came, he knew his role. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Brandon, too? I'd always thought he was just a pawn, an unwitting participant in Linda's schemes. But now I saw that he was more than that. He was complicit. He'd watched as she drained my father's life away, knowing that he'd inherit everything once Dad was gone. The anger inside me swelled, and I could barely hold it back. You both disgust me. My father trusted you, and you betrayed him, destroyed him, just so you could get his money, his house. Do you have any idea what you've done? Linda smirked, as though my outrage was amusing to her. Your father was already a broken man. I just helped him along. And look around, Adam. She gestured to the house, her voice dripping with satisfaction. This is ours now. You can scream and shout all you want, but you have no power here. I was shaking, my fists clenched so tightly my knuckles turned white, but I forced myself to stay calm, to keep my voice steady. Maybe you're right. Maybe I don't have power here. But the police might see things differently. That wiped the smug look off her face. She took a step back, suddenly uncertain. You wouldn't. You can't prove anything. Are you sure about that? I said, nodding toward the corner where my phone sat, recording her every word. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw real fear. She lunged for the phone, but I was faster, grabbing it and tucking it into my pocket before she could reach it. Good luck explaining yourself to the police, I said, my voice cold. We'll see how well your lies hold up in court. Linda's face contorted with rage, and I could see her mind racing, trying to come up with a way to wriggle out of this. But it was too late. She'd said enough, and I had it all on record. I turned and walked out, refusing to let her have the satisfaction of a final word. As I drove away, my hands were shaking. I felt a mixture of triumph and nausea, as though I'd won some twisted game I hadn't wanted to play. I went straight to Jake's, where he was waiting anxiously. She admitted it, I said, showing him the recording. It's all there. Everything she did, and Brandon's involvement too. Jake listened, his face growing darker with every word. We need to take this to the police, Adam. This is more than enough to open an investigation. I nodded, feeling a sense of grim satisfaction. I'm ready. I've waited long enough. The next day, Jake and I went to the police with the recording and every piece of evidence we'd gathered. The officers listened intently, their faces grim as they heard Linda's cold admissions. They assured us that they would investigate thoroughly and that there was a strong case to be made against her and Brandon. They even promised to look into my father's medical records to see if they could find traces of the poison. The legal process began soon after. Linda and Brandon were brought in for questioning, and though they both tried to deny everything, the evidence was too strong. The recording I'd made was enough to set off a full investigation, one that uncovered even more than I'd expected. It turned out that Linda had been systematically drugging my father for nearly 2 years, using low doses of toxins to weaken him and increase his dependency on her. When the case went to court, I was called in to testify. Standing there, facing Linda and Brandon as they sat in the defendant's box, was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Linda glared at me with pure hatred, while Brandon looked down, avoiding my gaze. But I forced myself to look at them, to hold my head high. I wasn't going to let them intimidate me. The trial was long and exhausting, but ultimately, justice was served. Linda was found guilty of manslaughter, and the judge didn't hold back in sentencing her. She was given 25 years in prison, a punishment that felt both satisfying and strangely empty. Brandon, for his part, was charged as an accessory to the crime. He received a lighter sentence of 10 years, with the court acknowledging his role in covering up his mother's actions. As I left the courthouse that day, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a lingering sense of betrayal that I knew would take time to heal. My father's life had been stolen, his legacy tainted, But at least now, he had justice. I only wished he could have been there to see it. Jake put a hand on my shoulder as we walked out. You did it, Adam. You made sure he didn't die in vain. I nodded, feeling the weight of it all settle over me. I just hope he knows wherever he is. And with that, I finally felt a sense of peace begin to creep in, a tiny light in the midst of a long, dark shadow. The aftermath of the trial felt surreal. Knowing that Linda and Brandon were behind bars didn't bring my father back, but it gave me a strange sense of closure. Justice had been served, and my father's memory was, in some way, restored. But there was an emptiness in me I couldn't shake. I kept asking myself what life might have been like if he'd been able to see through Linda's manipulation before it was too late. How many more years would we have had together? I couldn't dwell on it too long, though. The legal process had left a tangled web of property, assets, and family drama that needed untangling. After the trial, the state seized the assets Linda had fraudulently taken, including my father's house and his remaining finances. But it wasn't as simple as just signing them over to me. The courts needed to sift through the financial mess Linda had created, determining what was legally mine and what had been siphoned off or hidden away. I went back to the family home for the first time in months, accompanied by Jake. Even with Linda gone, the place felt tainted. I couldn't walk through the halls without seeing her shadow in every corner, remembering her twisted smile and the smug way she tried to assert control over my father's life. But I knew I needed to reclaim the house, to make it my own again, if I wanted to find peace. While sorting through the remnants of Dad's life, I discovered journals, tucked away in a closet I'd long forgotten about. I never remembered him being much of a writer, but flipping through the pages, I realized he'd started keeping notes in his final years. The handwriting was shaky in some places, almost illegible, but there were moments of clarity, little entries that gave me a glimpse into his thoughts. One entry, dated about a year before he died, stood out to me. In his uneven scrawl, he'd written, "Linda says I'm losing my mind, but it feels like there's something wrong, something I can't explain. I forget things I know I should remember. Sometimes I wonder if it's not just me, if maybe, *." The entry trailed off there, but it was enough. I read it over and over, his words confirming everything I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. He'd felt trapped, confused, and powerless, but he hadn't had the strength to fight back. Finding that journal renewed my determination to honor his legacy, to ensure no one would forget what he'd gone through or how he'd been betrayed. In the months following the trial, I poured myself into setting up a foundation in his name. I wanted it to support families in crisis, those affected by toxic relationships and abuse, especially those involving financial and emotional manipulation. Jake was fully behind the idea and even helped secure some early funding. We named it the Thomas Foundation, after my father, and it felt good to know that his memory would help others avoid a similar fate. I hoped that the foundation would provide resources and support for people trapped in situations like Dad had been, helping them recognize the signs of control and manipulation before it was too late. As the foundation grew, so did my circle of supporters. I started receiving emails and letters from people who had heard about my father's story, thanking me for speaking out and offering their own stories of heartbreak, manipulation, and resilience. I hadn't anticipated how widespread this problem was. It seemed there were countless families torn apart by similar circumstances, people manipulated by those they trusted most. The stories were heartbreaking, but also gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since my father's passing. Jake remained by my side, acting as a mentor and helping me with the foundation's legal and financial aspects. He'd always been there for me, but now, he felt more like a father figure than ever. We spent countless nights going over strategies, planning outreach programs, and brainstorming ways to reach families who might be suffering in silence. With each step forward, I felt the bitter anger from the past fading, replaced by a resolve to make a difference. One day, while going through some of my father's old paperwork, I stumbled upon a letter he'd written to me years before, though he'd never sent it. It was dated just after he married Linda, and it read, "Adam, I know things haven't been easy for us since Linda came into my life. I want you to know that my love for you has never changed, and it never will. I don't know where this path is leading, but if something ever happens to me, I want you to remember how proud I am of the man you've become. I hope you'll forgive any mistakes I've made and know that I only ever wanted the best for you. Asterisk. I read it over and over, each word sinking deep into my heart. He'd known, on some level, that things might go wrong, that he might lose control of his life. But he'd also trusted that I would find a way to make things right, no matter what. Holding that letter, I felt his presence in the room, his strength and his love. It was a gift I hadn't known I needed. As the foundation grew, I began to move on in small ways. I redecorated the house, changing the rooms that had felt haunted by Linda's presence. I painted the walls, replaced the furniture, and added touches that reminded me of Dad. The way he'd always loved books, so I filled the shelves with novels he used to read. The music he loved, playing softly in the background whenever I was home. Slowly, it started to feel like a new space, one where I could finally find peace. Then, just when I thought I'd left it all behind, I received a letter in the mail from Brandon. He had been in prison for 6 months by then, and I hadn't heard a word from him since the trial. The letter was brief, written in his slanted, hurried handwriting, but it caught me off guard. Asterisk, Adam, I know you hate me, and you have every reason to. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I didn't want any of this. Mom, she twisted me around, made me believe things I'm ashamed to admit now. I was a coward, and I let her control me. I didn't know how to stop her. Please believe me when I say I'm sorry, even if it doesn't mean much now. I hope someday you'll find a way to forgive me. Asterisk. I stared at the letter, not sure how to feel. Part of me wanted to tear it to pieces, to hold on to the anger I'd carried for so long. But another part, the part that had spent months working to help people in similar situations, couldn't ignore the vulnerability in his words. Brandon had been a pawn in Linda's scheme, a weak kid manipulated by a woman who knew exactly how to use him. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it added a layer of tragedy I hadn't expected. In the end, I didn't respond to his letter. I wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet, but I held on to it, tucking it away in a drawer alongside my father's journal and the letter he'd written to me. Maybe one day, when enough time had passed, I'd find it in me to let go of the resentment I still carried. But for now, it was enough to know that he regretted his actions. That was something, at least. With Linda and Brandon both out of my life, I felt a new sense of freedom. The weight of the past was finally lifting, and for the first time in years, I could look to the future with hope. I threw myself into the work with the foundation, finding a sense of purpose and helping others navigate their own struggles. The anger, the pain, the betrayal, they hadn't gone away entirely, but they'd softened, replaced by a sense of resolve to build something meaningful out of the ashes of my father's life. Jake continued to stand by my side, a steady presence as I moved forward. He'd lost a brother, just as I'd lost a father, and we shared an unspoken bond through that loss. Together, we were building something my father would have been proud of, something that would keep his memory alive in a way that mattered. And as the years passed, I found myself telling my story to others, sharing the lessons I'd learned from my father's life and death. People listened, often with tears in their eyes, and I could see the impact his story was having. It was his legacy, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's a way to find light. As I walked through the hallways of the Thomas Foundation one evening, watching as families gathered to learn, to heal, to rebuild, I felt a profound sense of peace. My father's story had become more than just a tragedy. It had become a beacon of hope. And in that moment, I knew that I'd finally found the closure I'd been searching for all along. A year had passed since Linda's conviction, and life had finally started to feel lighter. The foundation I'd built in my father's name was growing, helping families recognize and escape toxic situations. Through it, I met Lily, a compassionate counselor who quickly became someone special. She understood my past without judgment, and being with her felt like finally stepping into the light. One night, as I shared my story with her, she told me, "You're stronger than you realize, Adam. You turned your pain into something beautiful." Her words resonated deeply, and for the first time, I felt truly proud of how far I'd come. With her support and Jake's unwavering presence, I found myself moving forward, honoring my father's legacy while finally letting go of the shadows of the past.